Welcome to week 6, chapter 8. This week we're going to be taking a look at economic growth. So we've discussed GDP a little bit in a previous lesson. We looked at the components of GDP. So we know that GDP is our gross domestic product. And the gross domestic product is from the expenditures model perspective. All of the consumption, investment, government expenditures, and net exporting that occurs on final goods and services in an economy during a certain period of time. And normally we're going to be looking at that time period to be 1 year. So this chapter basically focuses most of its attention on discussing the term, what is economic growth, looking at worker productivity, describing the power of sustained economic growth. We also build a little bit into our aggregate production function. And then we look at trying to understand different situations such as convergence of GDP between developed and developing countries. And there are some arguments for convergence and against convergence. So it's a pretty straightforward chapter. I don't think you should have too many issues with it, but I did want to go over some of the concepts with you in this video that I hope clear up any confusion that might remain after reading the chapter. So one of the first things that the book talks about is looking at compound growth rates. So compound growth rates are something that we see, for example, with interest, compounding interest. If you have a savings account, you might notice this. Well, maybe not because the rates are so low. But if you have some sort of account which has interest applied to it, whether it's a credit card that's a debt that you owe or an account where you're earning interest, you'll notice that what happens is actually the interest rate, or for GDP, the growth rate, taken to the power of the amount of years that you're holding that asset times the starting amount. So say your checking account balance had $1,000 in it. To find out how much you would have in 5 years, you would take 1,000 times 1 plus, say 5% interest, 0.05 to the 5th years, and it would give you the amount you would have in your account at the end of 5 years. We can do the same thing for GDP. Let's look at an example. So for example, the GDP of the United States is around 18 or 19 trillion dollars. Okay. And if we were to say, well, if we have growth rates of 2% per year and we have them for the next 5 years, what will be the value of our GDP in 5 years? So 2% would be the amount of growth that we're experiencing. And 5 is the number of years we're looking at that growth happening. So every year we see 2% growth. Well, what will be the value of GDP in 5 years? Simply, let's see if my calculator actually has a scientific, I don't think it's going to have a scientific figure here. So, let me see. No, it doesn't. Oh, here we go. Okay, so what we can do is say 1 plus 0.02 will give us 1.02. And we take this to the 5th power. So 1.02 times 1.02 times 1.02 times 1.02 times 1.02. So let's see how to do that on this calculator. I'm not very sure of it. I'm more sure of it in Excel. Where is it here? Okay, so we'll have 1.1. So that's actually the amount of growth that we experience over time is 10.4% growth. So when we multiply that by 19 trillion, we'll see that the value of GDP in 5 years at 2% growth should be $20.98 trillion. So even small amounts of difference in economic growth, less or more, compounded over many, many years can have a profound impact on the long-run growth of an economy. And so that's something to take into consideration when we're looking at these figures. So let's say, for example, that instead of looking at 5 years, we looked at 50 years. So we'll clear this out. 1 plus 0.02 or 2% to the 50th power will give us 269% growth times 19 trillion. So our GDP at 2% should be about 51 trillion in 50 years, which is an extreme amount of time. Now, let's assume instead that each year, instead of having 2% growth, we only have 1% growth. Now you might say, well, 1% doesn't seem that different than 2%. And really on an annual basis, it's not. It's not going to yield a very different result in terms of the amount of production that we see or the growth in production. But what kind of difference does it yield over a 50-year time horizon? And these are kind of extremes here, so we should see a pretty big difference. So 1 plus 0.01 to the 50th power. So instead of seeing that 269% growth, we're really only seeing about 164% growth. Times 19 trillion will yield $31 trillion. So you can see that over very long time periods or long time periods with very similar but different rates of growth, we're going to have very different outcomes on GDP, and that's because of the power of compounding. So compounding being that what we're really doing here is we're saying $19 trillion in GDP times 1.02 times 1.02 times 1.02, and we're doing that 50 times. So in the long run in the United States, we actually see GDP rates when we are not in a recession in the 2 to 3% range. That's sort of the kind of growth that we should experience in the long run. Sometimes in the short run, we might have negative growth in GDP, which means that our GDP is actually contracting and the economy is going through a recession. So this should be when we are not in a recession. So this would be during normal periods of economic growth. One thing that we have to think about is, well, why do we experience economic growth? Why does GDP increase? Why is the total value? And again, we can look at real GDP versus nominal GDP, right? And we know that when we're looking at real GDP versus nominal GDP, we have removed the effects of inflation. So once we remove those effects of inflation, why do we see increases on all the production of consumer goods and investment goods and things the government's spending money on and net exports? Why does that happen? Well, the first reason is due, or the main reason is due to increases in worker productivity. So productivity is defined as the value of what is produced per worker per hour. So increases in productivity mean more can be produced per worker per hour. So we need to sort of quantify what is produced in some time frame, and when we see that more is being produced in the same time frame, we have increases in productivity. And so where do these increases in productivity come from? So we know that growth is based off of productivity. But why do we have productivity? To understand why we have productivity, we can look at what's called the aggregate production function. And so a basic production function being the process of a firm finding economic inputs and turning them into outputs. So we'll take economic inputs and make them into outputs. So we'll take raw materials, labor, and capital, and we'll turn them into goods and services that are purchased by either consumers or business or part of business investment by the government or by someone outside of the country. So that's a basic production function. An aggregate production function is going to be the process of taking all raw materials, labor, and capital or inputs, turning them into goods and services for the entire economy. And so really the aggregate production function very closely mirrors gross domestic product. And why does this happen? So we have GDP growth being based on increases in productivity, and productivity being based on the synthesis of different things which allow for inputs to be turned into output. And so what we need to synthesize is our population, the available human capital, the available physical capital, and technology. And once we combine all of these aspects of production, we will be able to turn inputs into outputs. So population of workers is really just going to be the people that are in the economy that can work and produce goods and services from raw materials or capital or their own minds, right? And they're going to have skills and education, and we call that human capital. They're going to use plant and equipment, which would be physical capital, to create goods and services. And they're harnessing technology with certain investments to make new products, new services, better products or services, or more products or services. So this is and or more products or services. And technology having this fixed amount of a certain population with certain skills and education, and utilizing different physical capital such as plant and equipment will harness technology to make new products and services, better products or services, and or more products or services. So this would be considered the aggregate production function, the process of So here is the definition for our aggregate production function. The process of an entire economy transforming inputs into outputs using the population of workers, human capital, physical capital, and harnessing technology to do this. So when we look at different countries, we've done a little bit of the calculations on how to calculate per capita GDP, so GDP per capita. And what does GDP per capita mean? It's going to be all of the production on goods and services during a year, final goods and services per individual. It's not so much that individual is going to get that the value of that GDP, but that it is technically pro rata available to them. So we can take out this distortion of the population of workers in comparing one. Okay, so when we're talking about per capita GDP, what we're doing is we're taking our aggregate production function, which really is the synthesis of our population, our human capital, skills and education, the physical capital that we have access to, and harnessing the available technology, and removing the effects of population differences. So we're able to do a better comparison between one country and another. So a question that might come up when you're looking at this material is, how should we view the third world or developing countries versus the United States or other developed countries from an economic perspective? Again, when we're comparing GDP, we were looking at, well, what is per capita GDP? So again, we can look at per capita GDP, and what we should see is that if we have human and physical capital deepening, technology gains, supportive government policies, and an economy with a free market orientation, we should say that the developing country should converge to similar growth levels and per GDP per capita as the United States. So capital deepening is referring to the idea that an economy has a higher average level of physical or human capital per person. So as we increase the amount of physical and human capital, so the actual plants and capital equipment, anything that's needed to create a good or a service, and the available education or skills that someone might have access to, then we'll see increases in capital, otherwise known as capital deepening. And economies should converge. Convergence is when economies with lower per capita GDP incomes are growing faster than developed countries. And what should happen is they should Now, their overall GDP will not be the same, remember, because we might have very different population sizes. But once we take out the effective population size by looking at per capita GDP or GDP per capita, their economic growth rates should at some point converge, and their GDP per capita should be very similar. So let's look at different rates of economic growth. I think that I had this in your PowerPoint slides, so I just wanted to pull it up real quickly and talk about it. Here we're looking at high, middle, and low income countries, and we have to look at different time periods. Obviously, what was going on globally between 2001 and 11 is very different than what happened between 1990 and 2000, so we split the two time periods apart. We had really robust economic growth here, and we did have robust economic growth here, but then we did have a fairly significant global recession, which erased a lot of that growth. So what we found is that between 1990 and 2000 and 2001 and 2011, that high-income countries tend to have the lowest growth rates of GDP. So year over year, the increase in GDP in a high-income country is about 2.7 to 1.6%. In middle-income countries, which are countries which have a lower per capita GDP, we see a little bit higher growth rates in GDP. And in low-income countries, we see pretty significant, but less significant than middle-income countries' GDP. So I think what we could also look at is individual countries here. In the fast growth, these tend to be low to middle income, so per capita GDP being somewhere in the middle to low range. These types of countries are experiencing very rapid economic growth. China, for example, India, Vietnam, all countries that you're probably very aware of economically. We're importing a lot from China and from India and from Vietnam in particular. Slower growth countries tend to be those that are the developed or extremely developing and are not developing very much. And so they might be the lowest income countries or the highest income countries. France, Italy, Japan, Switzerland. These are developed economies that have already gone through their industrial revolutions of taking capital and adding more and more capital per worker and experiencing the gains that they could experience. They've been through it. Countries like the Central African Republic, Haiti, Jamaica, These are countries which actually are either experiencing political issues, government policies which are maintaining their low income status and not allowing for them to increase capital deepening or experience capital deepening and have the benefits of a higher, a more skilled workforce that has access to more capital and greater levels of technology to be able to experience the growth that countries such as Vietnam, China, and India have experienced. Also, they might be in some sort of political strife, potentially in Africa. So we do see very different growth rates. Low to high income countries, high incomes such as the United States, most of the countries of Europe, Canada, those types of places are not experiencing rapid economic growth, and neither are low income countries, whereas middle income countries are experiencing the growth, and we see them here. So something to think about when we are contemplating, will convergence occur? Will these developing countries be able to catch up to the level of economic growth that we have experienced and the per capita GDP that we have right now in our country? So there are mixed reviews, and it's really specific to each country's situation. They won't always converge. They will not converge if the market is not free, and that there are policies in place by the government that do not allow for human and physical capital deepening. So they might remain at low economic growth rates and also then have low GDP per capita. But they can occur. Convergence can occur, and here's a couple of reasons they can occur. One, it's easier for developed countries to utilize capital or technology to educate their population, and they're not going to experience the diminishing returns on their investments that we do. Developed countries are experiencing higher levels of diminished returns to their investments. For example, if I have gone to college, the first 4 years I'm getting a lot of benefit from it. My master's, I'm getting a little bit more benefit. My PhD, some more benefit, but more and more years of education is really not going to benefit me too much. And in these developing countries, you can add a little bit of technology, like several hundred computers and some English lessons to several hundred people in a developing country. And now they might be able to run a business or a call center, some sort of technological support center. If we add those same investments, a few hundred computers and English lessons, to an already educated population in the United States, that's not going to boost economic growth too much. So higher levels of diminishing returns to investments exist in developed countries, and this is one of the reasons that convergence can occur, because really these developing countries can just add a little bit of technology, and a little bit of capital deepening can occur for human or physical capital, and they can see really robust results. Also, in a developing country, developed countries who have already produced technology will share that technology with a developing country, and they will then put it into place, and it will be very useful for them, perhaps boosting their economic growth. However, we are, as a nation, mostly taxed with creating this technology, and creating the technology takes time, it takes effort, and it takes a lot of money to develop and create, and therefore we are not going to experience the sort of great increases in economic growth, because it's assumed that we're already using all available technology, whereas a developing country can just borrow some existing technology, put it into place very quickly, and see their goods and services that they're producing be produced much more efficiently and benefit from that economic boost. So some reasons you might not see this happen, however, are that in a developing country, they might not actually be able to harness the technologies for one reason or another. And if they're not able to successfully harness these technologies that have already been created in the developed world, then they might not experience growth. And the other reason they might not experience growth is because it does take a lot of time to converge when your GDP levels are so different. So let's look at an example, and we'll use our compounding growth rates again. So say this is the United States. And in the United States, we have GDP per capita of $40,000. So what will this look like in 30 years? Using a very moderate growth rate of 2%, in 30 years, the GDP per capita for the United States will be 1 plus 0.02 to the 30th power times 40. So about $72,000. Now, if we have a similarly, or an economy that's very not similar, developing country, and they have a low GDP per capita, their GDP per capita is only $3,000. Well, even if they're growing at 7%, what will their GDP per capita look like in 30 years? And so we want to insert 7% for their growth rate. $22,836. So even though one country has been growing only at 2%, it started out with a much higher GDP per capita. And the effects of compounding have really increased that GDP per capita all the way to $72,454 per person. In the developing country, even though their annual growth rate is more than 3 times that of the developed country, in 30 years, they are still not going to have the same amount of GDP per capita as the developed country. And therefore, it's just going to take a lot of time. Let's look at this and see what happens in 50 years, or 60 years, for example. So we're just doing a comparison between the two countries, one with 2% growth and one with 7% growth, and seeing what happens in 60 years. So now this is also an assumption, but if you notice what happens when we actually look at it in a much longer time horizon, we see that it is actually then possible for the developing country to outpace the developed country. What is not being put into our model here, and I obviously wasn't able to solve for the year at which they have the same GDP per capita. But at some point, this country, once their GDP per capita becomes close to that of the United States or of other developing countries, their growth rate will fall off. And this probably will not happen. Their growth rates will converge, and their GDP per capita will converge to a similar level. So, in conclusion, I would say this week, make sure you understand what GDP is before you start this out. Know how to do compounded growth rates to calculate GDP. Understand a couple of ideas. Why do we have economic growth? It's based off of productivity. why is productivity so important? What allows to have, what is the reason we have production in the first place? Well, this is due to the components of our aggregate production function. And is it possible for developing countries to have similar rates of economic growth as the United States that produce similar levels of real GDP per capita in the long run? So again, thank you for listening, and let me know if you have any questions on the quiz or how you should respond to your discussion forum post. I wish you all a wonderful week. Thanks. Bye.